Welcome to Novara Live on this, I think, fairly grey bank holiday Monday, though I'm not sure because all the curtains in the studio are closed. I'm joined by Kieran and Andrieu. Thank you so much for joining us on, I suppose, what for many people is a day off, but I'm not going to be here feeling sorry for myself. How are you doing, Kieran?
I'm okay, Michael, and the curtains are undrawn in this room, so I can confirm that it is fairly grey outside.
Thank God. Coming up tonight, Donald Trump seems to have potentially realised that Vladimir Putin doesn't actually want peace in Ukraine. This has very much surprised him, and he's called him crazy, I think. I also speak to Paris Marx, a tech journalist, about AI. Paris is, I suppose, more sceptical of the AI doomers, or at least the people who think that AI could pose an existential risk to society than me and Aaron were on Friday. So we have a bit of a debate about that. Gary Lineker has said goodbye on Match of the Day. Fair to say, a fairly little moving outro. He seemed almost in tears. I think it shows why the BBC were mistaken to let him go. And we show you a clip of Zack Polanski on the BBC. Obviously, he is running to be Green leader. And his whole pitch is that I'm the person who can put forward left-wing ideas in a sort of proactive way on the TV. So you can make a judgment as to whether he sort of fulfilled that aim, that task he's set for himself. Stay tuned for all of that, of course, as ever. If you'd like to support our work, you can sign up at novaramedia.com/support. And make sure to let us know your comments as we go in the comments box. We do always want to hear your views. Of course, you can also tweet on the hashtag Novara Live. Let's go straight into our first story, though. An Israeli airstrike in the early hours of this morning has killed dozens of Palestinians sheltering in a former school. The blast instantly engulfed the building in flames, with this young girl filmed trying to find a path through the inferno as the building threatened to collapse around her. 6-year-old Wad al-Sheikh Khalil was eventually rescued from the fire, but her family were not so fortunate. Only her father survived the blast, with her mother and sister both killed. The Farm al-Jawi school in Gaza City had been used by displaced Palestinians as a shelter before it was bombed. At least 36 people were killed in the attack, many of them children. Another young girl was pulled unconscious from beneath the smoking rubble of the school. We can confirm that she did somehow survive, with other footage showing her conscious and receiving medical attention. The Israeli military has given its usual justification for killing Palestinian children, describing the school as a command and control complex for Hamas and saying the victims of their assault were human shields. This is a translation of a statement from the IDF explaining their actions. The command and control complex was used by the terrorists to plan and gather intelligence with the aim of carrying out terrorist attacks against citizens of the State of Israel and IDF forces in the area. Prior to the attack, many steps were taken to reduce the chance of harming civilians, including using precision weapons, aerial observations, and additional intelligence. Precision weapons, which just happened to destroy the entire school, setting it on fire and killing a bunch of children. Those families sheltering in the school weren't the only ones to be destroyed or to be killed by Israel in recent days. Dr. Ala al-Najjar is a pediatric doctor at the Nasser Hospital in Khan Yunis, a mother of 10 children of her own. She worked to save the lives of the very youngest victims of Israel's war on Gaza. On Friday, though, unspeakable horror struck for her. 9 of her 10 children were killed when Allah's family home was struck by an Israeli missile while she was working at the hospital. Footage too graphic to play here shows the charred and dismembered bodies of some of those children being pulled from the rubble of the destroyed house. Just one of her children, 11-year-old Adam, survived. He underwent surgery at the Nasser Hospital and is in a moderate condition. Her husband, Hamdi al-Najjar, also a doctor at Nasser Hospital, was at home with the children when Israel attacked. He remains in critical condition with severe brain injuries. The head of nursing at Nasser Hospital told The Guardian this. Dr. Ala al-Najjar watched her with her own eyes as the charred bodies of her 7 children were pulled from beneath the rubble, while 2 remain missing, all while she was on duty at Nasser Medical Complex. Harrowing details recounted by Ali al-Najjar paint one of the most heartbreaking tragedies to befall a paediatrician who dedicated her life to saving children, only to have her own motherhood stolen in a moment of fire and deafening silence. British volunteer medics Graham Groom and Victoria Rose are also working at Nasser Hospital. In a video update, they described the murder of Alaa al-Najjar's children.
The last patient on my list today was an 11-year-old boy who seemed much younger as we lifted him onto the operating table. His injuries were bad enough, but the background, I think, was worse. In an attack that may have or not have been aimed at his father was very badly injured, but 9 of his brothers and sisters were killed.
And his mum is a paediatrician at the hospital, and I was sent a video of them going to the house. They lived opposite a petrol station, so I don't know whether the bomb set off some massive fire, but the video shows all of the children being pulled out with fire, and they're absolutely charcoal to crisp. It's like
I think it is unimaginable that for that poor woman, both of them are doctors here. The father was a physician here at the Nasser Hospital. We've asked about him. He had no political and no military connections. He doesn't seem to be prominent on social media. And yet his poor wife is the only uninjured one who has the prospect of losing her husband, has already lost 9. Yes. I think a particularly sad day, but that is life in Gaza.
That's the way it goes in Gaza.
That's the way it goes in Gaza, they say. And responding to a request for comment from the New York Times, the Israeli military said this about the attack on the al-Najjar home. The Khan Yunis area is a dangerous war zone. Before beginning operations there, the IDF evacuated civilians from this area for their own safety. So, I mean, they can say that about every single part of Gaza. Every city in Gaza is a war zone because the Israelis are bombing every building in those cities. Obviously, presumably, they want people to be evacuated to the Al-Mawasi so-called safe zone, which they also bomb. And which, seems to just be a dreadful place to be. Then you get bombed in tents instead of getting bombed in your home. The Israeli military has been killing Palestinians with impunity in the Gaza Strip for almost 20 months, while Western governments have stood silently by or actively supported their crimes. Of course, many, many months too late. Some European politicians are now beginning to shift their tone. So the government of Spain is pushing for international sanctions against Israel. So they were already very critical of Israel, but this is now, I suppose, threatening real concrete action. The Netherlands have persuaded the EU as a whole to look at trade embargoes with Israel. I suppose looking at trade embargoes is very different from sort of applying them. Ireland is moving to ban trade with Israeli companies in the occupied territories. Of course, Ireland have been relatively strong on this. Today, this is interesting, German Chancellor Friedrich Merz has said Israel's war on Gaza is no longer justified. And that's, of course, a significant step for a country which has up until now been very, very closely aligned with Israel. As you can probably imagine, Merz is still remaining fairly mealy-mouthed and hasn't suggested any consequences should be applied to Israel. The British government also very mealy-mouthed this weekend. This was Deputy Prime Minister Angela Rayner discussing Israel's assault on Gaza on the BBC.
Given that blockade on aid, given the many thousands killed, given the extent of the devastation that people have seen in Gaza, do you think Israel's breaking international law?
Well, that's not for me to determine, but we've made our representations of concerns around what's happening on the West Bank. We've been very clear about aid getting into Gaza, and we've raised those concerns. It's pretty clear that the Prime Minister has said aid has to get in. Mm-hmm. The language that has been used by some ministers is inflammatory at best, and that we've called that out and said it's not acceptable.
Yes, the principle of whether or not Israel is breaking international law is a very important one. And some of the UK's other allies, Spain has said it, France has said it clearly. The Foreign Secretary said it, more or less, and then took it back a bit later on in the day, or
we've said
clarified
that's
his
a
remarks.
determination for the ICJ, and we've said that we uphold international law. And we're very clear on that, but we have raised concerns. You'll have heard what the Prime Minister said. Aid has to get into Gaza. The situation and the violence in the West Bank has to stop, and that we need to see a path for peace. We need to see the release of hostages, and we want to see a long-term solution where there is the two states of Israel and Palestine living in peace together, and that's where the Prime Minister's focus is.
She sounds kind of like, a teacher at a nursery. This should happen, and this should happen, and this should happen. It's like, we'll do something about it. Right? Our government is raising concerns. How fantastic. In the meantime, 54,000 people have been killed in Gaza, which is probably an underestimate, right? Because it's very difficult to count the dead when a genocide is going on. Now, as you saw from that Angela Rayner interview, our political and media class find it almost impossible to tell the truth about what Israel is doing to Palestinians in Gaza. Now, why is that? It's because our elites in Westminster, as well as in large parts of the media, prefer to ignore inconvenient truths like an ally committing genocide, a so-called ally, I should say. Our journalism here is different. It's based on facts, not vibes, not alliances, and not what's convenient. And that means we've been able to say what's true right from the start of Israel's assault on Gaza, when I suppose people like Laura Kuenssberg have beaten around the bush. It's also why you should support Novara Media from as little as £1 hour's wage per month. We need a media that tells the truth now more than ever. We can't do it without you, though. If you want to help us to do more of what we do best, go to www.novaramedia.com/support. The link's in the description box below. We really do appreciate it. Kieran, I'm not going to ask you about why people should support Novara Media. I'm instead going to, I suppose, ask you about that, I think, really quite appalling interview by Angela Rayner, given everything that we've seen this weekend.
Angela Rayner is defined by her ineffectualness in that interview, and she will be remembered for her criminal ineffectualness. And there were so many lies in that interview. I mean, just to pick one, that Britain upholds international law and will abide by the rulings of the ICJ. Britain has already given diplomatic immunity, legal immunity to members of the Israeli government visiting members of the British government in Britain on British soil, and has invited, and of course the invitation has been accepted, David Lammy and others to Israel. So it's complete nonsense. Britain is still, as we know, heavily involved in arming and profiting from the genocide in Gaza. And I'll just say about things in general, this is going to go all the way to the last drop of the last Gazan's blood unless the world intervenes. Israel's not going to stop. We've had 19 months of thinking that we've reached the summit of all human cruelty, of evil. And yet, day after day, week after week, month after month, Israel outdoes itself. And we've had 19 months as well of people thinking, no, this is a red line. Surely, if Israel does this, the international community will get involved, only to find that, I won't say the international community, because of course civil society has organised and is opposed en masse. And those are things that need credit and recognition. But only to find that the governments of the world care so little about Palestinian life that they're not even willing to restrain themselves from selling Israel the weapons and the equipment to carry out its mass extermination of Palestinians in Gaza. There is absolutely no humanity left to appeal to in any significant portion among the Israeli public. It brings me absolutely no pleasure to say that. And it brings me no pleasure to say that Israeli society as a whole has been swallowed up by a rapture of genocidal lust. That's where we are. We've heard it time and time again from Israelis, not just in the political class and the military class, but ordinary Israelis in vox pops. We've heard these aren't children. These are monsters waiting to happen. These aren't children. These are terrorists in potentia, in waiting. or these aren't children, these are anti-Semites waiting to grow up. And of course, that's in itself not new in the Israeli psyche. Quite aside from the fact that hundreds of thousands of Palestinian children were displaced or murdered in the Nakba, it was Golda Meir, Israeli Prime Minister, the first and only woman Prime Minister Israel's ever had, Prime Minister from 69 to 74, who said, and I quote, "We can forgive the Palestinians for killing our children, but what we cannot forgive them for is forcing us to kill their children." It's a psychopath's aphorism, if ever I've heard one. I don't just want to speak through the prism of my jadedness or bitterness or disappointment as a Palestinian who has only lived 37 years and yet in those 37 years has seen everything deteriorate beyond my wildest nightmares. It is strategically good, forget morally, it is strategically good that some of these images and these stories of starvation and of, flames engulfing children are now finally making it onto the BBC, making it onto Sky News, and so on. And I'm glad, of course I am, that some journalists and cultural figures who have been historically pro-Israel are now starting to say, no, this is too far, too much. Again, focusing strategically, I say nothing of their morality. But I repeat, this will go to the last drop of the last Gazan's blood if we let it. And if we let it, nobody can say that they weren't told over and over and over and over again.
No, I think that's very well put. For 20 months now, and still it's sort of like, we've raised concerns 20 months later. Russia has carried out its largest ever aerial attack on Ukraine. According to Kyiv's Air Force, Russia launched 355 drones and 9 cruise missiles against Ukraine overnight. At least 12 people were killed and dozens more were injured. Now, that was the third of a series of nightly attacks by the Kremlin on Ukraine. According to Russia's spokesperson, Dmitry Peskov, the wave of strikes are a response to what he called Ukraine's attacks on Russia's social infrastructure. But posting online, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said this, only a sense of total impunity can allow Russia to carry out such strikes and continue increasing their scale. There is no real military logic to this, but there is significant political meaning. In doing this, Putin shows just how much he despises the world that spends more effort on dialogue with him than on real pressure. Like any criminal, Russia can only be constrained by force. Only through strength, the strength of the United States, of Europe, of all nations that value life, can these attacks be stopped and real peace achieved. The large-scale attacks on Ukraine also seem to have taken US President Donald Trump, and by surprise, he gave reporters this reaction to the Russian assault.
An update. I'm not happy with what Putin's doing. He's killing a lot of people, and I don't know what the hell happened to Putin. I've known him a long time, always gotten along with him. But he's sending rockets into cities and killing people, and I don't like it at all.
Nothing's changed. Absolutely nothing has changed. Right? This is a surprise to no one on earth other than Donald Trump. Later, Trump elaborated on those remarks on Truth Social's own platform. I've always had a very good relationship with Vladimir Putin, but something has happened to him. He's gone absolutely crazy. He is needlessly killing a lot of people, and I'm not just talking about soldiers. Missiles and drones are being shot into cities in Ukraine for no reason whatsoever. I've always said that he wants all of Ukraine, not just a piece of it, and maybe that's proving to be right. But if he does, it will lead to the downfall of Russia. Likewise, President Zelensky is doing his country no favors by talking the way he does. Everything out of his mouth causes problems. I don't like it, and it better stop. This is a war that would never have started if I were president. This is Zelensky's, Putin's, and Biden's war, not Trump's. I am only helping out. Or I'm only helping to put out the big and ugly fires that have been started through gross incompetence and hatred. The Kremlin has responded to Trump's remarks saying this. Of course, the start of the negotiation process, for which the American side made a lot of effort, is a very important achievement. And we are truly grateful to the Americans and personally to President Trump for their help in organizing and launching this negotiation process. It's a very important achievement, of course. At the same time, this is a very important moment, which is connected to an emotional overload of everyone involved and emotional reactions. That's a pretty polite way of saying, we're not crazy, you are. I think Trump is more crazy than the Russians. I don't think craziness is a very good explanation for what Vladimir Putin is doing and what he's been doing. since 2023. I suppose that statement also potentially implies that Trump's days brokering a ceasefire agreement between Ukraine and Russia might be numbered. The latest wave of attacks comes just days after Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin had a 2-hour phone call to discuss a US proposed ceasefire deal. The US president said afterwards that he believed the call had gone very well, adding that Russia and Ukraine would immediately start negotiations towards an end to the war. That, of course, seems somewhat far-fetched now, even though Ukraine had publicly agreed to that 30-day ceasefire last week. Meanwhile, French President Emmanuel Macron told reporters he thought Trump had been played, saying this. President Trump realizes that when President Putin said on the phone he was ready for peace, or told his envoys he was ready for peace, he lied. We have seen once again in recent hours Donald Trump express his anger, a form of impatience. I simply hope now that this translates into action. European countries are currently trying to put together a package of further sanctions against Russia, though Trump has so far refused to participate. And in response to the strikes on Ukraine, Europe has also today agreed to lift the long-range restrictions that it imposed on missiles it sends to Ukraine. That means Ukraine will now be able to fire even deeper into Russian territory. An interesting interview in The Telegraph this weekend may help explain Trump's reluctance to take a more aggressive stance with Putin. And this is from Fiona Hill. She was one of the US government's top Russia advisors during the first Trump administration, where she sat on the President's Security Council. She would later go on to testify against Trump during his 2019 impeachment hearing. Now, this is how she assessed Trump's understanding of Putin. She says, terrible. Let's give him a pass for effort. What Trump is doing is answering the wrong exam question. Trump thinks it's just about real estate, about trade and who gets what, be it minerals, land or rare earths. But Putin doesn't want a ceasefire. He wants a neutered Ukraine, not one that is able to withstand military pressure. Everybody sees that apart from Trump. Hill also had an assessment of the meaning of the Russia-Ukraine war, one that might mean a bilateral ceasefire is now genuinely impossible. So she told The Telegraph this: world wars are when you have global sets of conflicts that become intertwined. That's where we are. So kind of a suggestion we're already in a world war, World War III. I don't think by sort of most popular understandings of what a world war means, we are in one. Kieran, do you think we're in World War III?
I think it's boring for people when we completely agree on everything, Michael, but I completely agree with what you just said about this. It doesn't seem to me to be credible at all that we're in World War III. I suppose what Fiona Hill might mean is that we're in a kind of powder keg type environment, as was said of the build up to World War One. Described as a powder keg in which lots of powerful actors are navigating various alliance systems and so on. I don't really see that here. I mean, I think lots of wars have been going on in different parts of the world that have been connected through proxies or through a connection to the hegemon, the regional hegemon, forever. And actually, there were probably more active conflicts tied up in this way in a kind of network of related conflicts in the 1970s during the Cold War, when much of that was being fought out in the global south, and the 1990s, and with the war on terror in the early 2000s. So I don't really put much stock in that claim, as I understand it anyway. There's something so kitsch about reading a Trump post, a kind of unfiltered Trump post, especially about something as serious as all of this. And I think I do just want to briefly say, because I know, I mean, in my experience of being on Novara Live, this is the one topic where you win over nobody. Everybody is polarized and nobody is pleased with what you say, in my experience. Maybe it was just me, but I think it was all of us. And one of the positions I tried to take a few months ago was that it was good that these talks were being had. And, it doesn't pay, I think, to continue to fuel the war by giving Ukraine loads and loads of money. And I don't think it's got a realistic chance of winning militarily. So let's try and, shift resources into that kind of diplomatic domain. And I'm very disappointed. I mean, I'm very happy to say on air, I don't think I ever thought Trump was Bismarck, But I did think that any kind of truce or negotiations would be fleshed out, hashed out in a kind of more realistic fashion. And it just seems that what's happened is, I don't know, very short of that.
And I think the stupid thing that Trump did wasn't saying negotiations would be a good thing. It was saying negotiations would be a good thing, and then immediately conceding everything that Vladimir Putin wanted and pretending that the negotiation was with the invaded party instead of the invader. So the whole thing was that this war can end if only Vladimir Zelensky wants it to end. And then sort of over a few weeks, you realize that, actually, it's Vladimir Putin who's most keen on the war, which kind of makes sense given he's the guy who started it.
And not to get too technical about this kind of thing, but game theory is often overplayed as a kind of, the idea that it's rational actors around the table and they have a kind of clear-eyed sense of their own interests, and that's how they flesh out a kind of piece based on that. But there is an element of that, you would hope, in most negotiations, successful negotiations between actors with varying degrees of power. And I just think that actually it's pretty obvious that Trump either doesn't have the brain to understand that or is just signally unwilling to understand that. And so you get the kind of manifestations of that you just referred to, Michael, giving everything away being a good example.
Yeah, I mean, is he incapable? Is he unwilling? You kind of split the difference, and it's a bit of both. That's my expert psychological analysis of the President of the United States. For a while now, I've been pretty obsessed with the speed of AI advance, what it might mean for culture and politics, for the economy, and yes, whether it might kill us all. This was the first AI-produced video, though, that really blew my mind.
A girl told me we're made of prompts. Like, seriously, dude, you're saying the only thing standing between me and $1 billion is some random text?
Honestly, the biggest red flag is when the guy believes in the prompt theory. Like, really? We came from prompts? Wake up, man.
You want to convince me that this perfect creation behind me is the result of ones and zeros? A binary code and nothing more? It makes no sense.
Imagine you're in the middle of a nice date with a handsome man and then he brings up the prompt theory. Yuck. We just can't have nice things.
We're not prompts! We're not prompts!
Where is the prompt writer to save you from me? Where is he? You still believe we're made of prompts?
Anyone who tells you we're just ones and zeros is delusional. If that's all we are, then why does it hurt when we lose someone?
Vote for me and I'll ban the prompt theory from schools. There's no place for that nonsense in our lives.
For spreading the false theory that we are nothing but ones and zeros, this court sentences you to 12 years in federal custody.
I don't need some prompt God whispering in my ear to tell a story. I write what I want. I have free will, remember that?
I know for a fact we're made of prompts. Deny it all you want. The signs are everywhere.
You know how I know we're made of prompts? Because nothing makes sense anymore. We used to have 7 fingers per hand. I remember it clearly. Now we just have 5 fingers per hand.
Now, so the reason I found that so powerful was not just because that's all made by AI. None of those were real people, right? So I think that's pretty phenomenal. But also, it's the first sort of AI video I've watched that wasn't slop. Like, it was actually really smart. Now, as far as I understand, the AI didn't come up with a script. A human came up with the script, and then they sort of fed the AI instructions as to how to make that script into a sort of audio visual experience. But I think it showed, what you can do with this stuff. Obviously, it's a satire based on the simulation theory, is the idea that we're all living in a simulation. This is a sort of update of it based on, well, they've called it prompt theory, which is everything that goes on in AI is basically a response to a prompt. So all of those characters you saw there were a response to a prompt, and they're realizing in the film that, or they're suggesting in the film that might be what's happening and rejecting it as we would, I think, if we were just created by prompts living in a simulation. That video was made by the director Hashem Al-Ghaili, using Google's new text-to-video software called VO3. Google launched that last week. Obviously, I think the realism poses major challenges to the creative industry, and there's pretty scary implications when it comes to whether we'll ever be able to believe anything we see on film again. I think it really is, though, because you might say, well, I could tell that they weren't real people. There, though, it's the pace of change that really matters. So this video posted on X juxtaposes how generative AI has changed in the past 3 years through the medium of Will Smith eating spaghetti. So on the left, you can see in 2023, that's what it looked like. Very, very janky. You'd never believe that was real footage of Will Smith eating spaghetti. By the time you get to 2024, it looks quite good. And it's this VO3 update, which means that you now have sound alongside it. At the launch of VO3, Google's CEO boasted about how the software could support creatives. They've done a tie-up with the director Darren Aronofsky to show how it can be used to create high-end products. That film will be out late this year. I personally think the clip we showed you at the beginning was also a high-end product, but obviously it's not a feature film. Of course, though, it's inevitable, really, isn't it? The more common use of a program like VO3 will be to create what's known as AI slop. This is a report from the journalist James Lee.
Are there actually men in the world that don't think that tattoos are attractive? Like, I'm asking, like, seriously. I got all these tattoos because I thought that it was going to make me hotter.
Yeah, I don't know if you guys could tell, but this is not a real person. It's not a real opinion. It's just AI rage bait. Yeah, there's now a huge budding economy built off of inventing a fake person tailor-made specifically to trigger you, to make you mad, to torment you, and most importantly, to then monetize that rage. We're talking about people making $50,000, $60,000 per month off of AI-generated content like this. Analysts are predicting an almost 20% year-over-year growth of AI video content, growing from about $700 million right now to over $2 billion in 2032. Google, a few days ago, just came out with their VO3 state-of-the-art video generation model. You can do sound effects, background noises, dialogue. The quality is freaking insane.
Please, don't finish writing that prompt. I don't want to be in your AI movie. Please, leave me alone.
Please, man. Please! Write a prompt that will make us happy. Do it for once.
None of us is real. We're here because someone decided to write a prompt. We all hate him for it.
Oh, we are so toast.
So are we toast? And what are the implications of generative AI making hyper-realistic videos? Well, earlier today, I caught up with Paris Marx. He's host of the Tech Won't Save Us podcast. Now, as you can imagine from the podcast title, Paris casts a skeptical eye on the claim that AI will revolutionize our societies or indeed pose an existential threat to them. I'm more impressed, I suppose, by AI's progress. Not necessarily impressed in that I think it's a great thing, but I do think it does seem very significant. And indeed, I'm not dismissive of the existential threat arguments. You'll see some of those tensions play out in this interview. I began, though, by asking him what he thinks the implications of VO3 are.
I think there are a few, basically, right? You can look on the one hand at how much easier it's going to be to create kind of content that looks accurate, that looks correct, but is actually false and misleading. We already see this kind of stuff proliferating on social media platforms, but often to create it, you need to go through multiple different, generative content tools. You use one to output the image, and then you use the image to create the video. You use something else to get audio. Now, if you can use a tool like VO3, then, it kind of reduces the friction to be able to create that sort of, content. Then there are the broader issues that we've been looking at with these things, for the past few years, where is it going to be easier to make non-consensual, explicit imagery of people? Is it going to be easier to use to kind of attack labor and attack the workers who generally, make kind of, different creative content and things like that? So those are the things that immediately come to mind for me.
And you're a tech journalist. You've got a podcast about tech and AI. And so I suppose I want a favor from you in a way, which is something I always struggle to do, which is sort of, can you explain, what does it mean to say this is a video that was created by generative AI?
In what sense, really?
Well, I suppose how do you, if someone's saying, I don't even know what that means to say that this video was created by generative AI, you're saying it's somewhat, you're converting text to image, but sort of what's going on in the background in a way that, someone without a coding degree might understand.
Yeah, absolutely. So basically what we have here, how these generative AI models in general come about is that you have these companies that have a lot of centralized computational resources, and they go out and collect, an amount of data that is hard to really imagine, right? And then they use all of that data in order to train large models that are basically predictive, right? So you're entering these kind of prompts to give an idea for what the model should output. And because it has used so much data, because it is using so much computation, it can better approximate what you're trying to get out of it than it could have in the past. And it can generate the types of outputs that wouldn't have been possible with less computation and less data in the past, which is why now, we have these chatbots that, appear more advanced than chatbots that we've used in the past. The types of images and the types of videos that we can have outputted are higher quality than the types of things that we've been able to get. But as a result of that, there's a lot of data that's needed. There's a lot of energy and computation that's needed to do that, which is why, there are debates about the climate impacts of these things. So I would argue that that is where that comes from and basically what is happening there.
And I know sort of your podcast and lots of the people you speak to, and sort of, I suppose there is a big journalistic community really, which is quite skeptical of the claims that the AI companies make, and sort of, I suppose about the revolutionary impact of this. You think that there's a lot of, the phrase AI hype is used quite a lot. I suppose personally, when I look at, a video like the ones made from VO3, and obviously Twitter's full of them, and I see the sort of pace of progress from 2 years ago, it just seems to me that this is clearly going to be a very impressive revolutionary technology. And I feel like, lots of the things that people 2 years ago were saying, oh, well, ChatGPT is useless. It can never explain how when you move a table, the orange moves with the table instead of sort of staying in the same position in space. There were lots of things where it said, ChatGPT is never going to understand these concepts. And then 2 years later, they do. And I suppose, do you ever look at the pace of AI change and think, maybe actually this is a bigger deal than sort of some people in I suppose it's usually on the left, but sort of in the tech skeptic or the AI skeptic wing of journalism have sort of assumed before?
I think it depends on really what you mean in terms of a big deal, right? I've never doubted that the technologies will not have an impact. The question is, what impact will they ultimately have? And I think my skepticism is around the claims of the tech companies actually being the types of claims that are realized at the end of the day, right? Because on the one hand, they're trying to sell them to us as like, these are technologies that could potentially, have some impact on like whether the future of the human species is going to be alive because we're going to get artificial general intelligence that might not, want humans to live or something like that, which just seems fantastical to me. And I can go into that further if you want. But then on the other hand of things, it's like, these are going to be so helpful and so beneficial because they're going to be able to replicate doctors and replicate teachers and, all of these wonderful social functions, right? And I'm very doubtful that that is going to be the real impact of how these technologies are going to roll out. But that doesn't mean that I don't think that they're going to be impactful in other ways, right? Some of the ways that I talked about earlier, when we're seeing these advances in the types of things that they can do, the types of outputs that they can make, we can see very clearly that it's very useful for large social media companies in order to keep up engagement on their platforms through the proliferation of AI-generated content and the use of AI-generated chatbots and things like that, right? We can see that there are certain, types of content creators who see that it's very easy to create a lot of appealing and engaging content that they are potentially going to make money off of, which can also be used for misleading purposes as they proliferate through these platforms. One of the, I think, big stories that doesn't get nearly as much attention as it deserves with, generative AI is the way that it has been used overwhelmingly for non-consensual explicit imagery of people. And that is kind of a story that really gets hidden away when we're talking about all the wonderful progress that it's making, right? That progress has real impacts on people. And then for me, one of the bigger things there too is the impact on labor and workers. I always think back to the mid-2010s when we were talking a lot about how AI was going to eliminate all of these jobs and self-driving cars were going to mean we were going to have no taxi drivers and all this kind of stuff. That is not really what happened. What we had was the use of those technologies for algorithmic management to legitimize the gig economy and its use of algorithmic management as well. I think with generative AI, what we're going to see is a renewed attack on labor. And indeed, we're already seeing that in companies like Klarna and Duolingo that are using this to displace workers. And we're going to see that on a greater scale as the advance continues.
Now, that was just part of a much longer interview with Paris Marx that I conducted this afternoon. We're going to be putting that out tomorrow. So do check that out. We sort of went back and forth on me thinking AI is quite a big deal and Paris being much more skeptical. So whichever side you're on, do check that out tomorrow. Gary Lineker has presented his last ever match of the day after being forced to leave thanks to his support for the children of Gaza. This was his emotional farewell.
Alan, Micah, thank you. I suspect our paths will cross again very shortly. Let me take this opportunity to thank all of the other pundits that I've had the pleasure of working with over the last 25 years. You've made my job so much easier. Also, a huge thank you to those you don't see at home. The work that goes into making this iconic show is a huge team effort, from the editors to the analysis team, from the commentators to the floor managers, from the producers to the camera operators, from the PAs to the subs. Thank you all. You're the very best. Rather like my football career, everyone else did all the hard work and I got the plaudits. It's been an absolute privilege to have hosted Match of the Day for a quarter of a century. It's been utterly joyous. I'd like to wish Gabby, Mark and Kelly all the very best when they sit in this chair. The programme is in the best of hands. And my final thank you goes to all of you. Thank you for watching. Thank you for all your love and support over the years. It's been so special and I'm sorry that your team was always on last. Time to say goodbye. Goodbye.
Well done.
Thanks.
Well done.
I mean, I thought it was really touching, right? I mean, I watch Match of the Day when I'm at my dad's house sometimes. I'm not a huge football fan, so this is not the biggest news in the world to me that that's his last show. But from, he's been on it 25 years. I've seen a lot of Gary Lineker, presenting Match of the Day or the World Cup or whatever. And I think that clip just shows how foolish it was for the BBC to get rid of the guy, right? He's just clearly a nice guy. Audiences love him. There is sort of like a noisy minority of people in the right-wing press or on GB News or wherever who can't stand the guy. But the reason they can't stand the guy is because he's so engaging, because he's so likable, right? He seems like a decent guy who's not particularly ideological or political. He's like a competent, engaging person who can tell right from wrong. And I do think it is very telling that the thing which finally crossed the line, for the BBC, where they couldn't take the pressure anymore, was that he really objected to kids getting burned alive by Israel, right? That was why he had to go. Now, obviously, he shared a video that had a small emoji of a rat, right? So he was right to apologize for that. But the idea that sharing that, he's been one of the most vocal people when it comes to calling out what Israel are doing in Gaza from the start, from the very start. And that really matters. And it was really threatening, I think, to the Israel lobby that you had someone who is in people's living rooms every day, not every day, but every Saturday or whatever, not for being a political figure, but for being a nice, likable, relatable dude, used to be a footballer, very talented, now talks about football, who can also tell right from wrong. Like they hated that. Obviously, the BBC have been looking for an excuse to get rid of him for ages because before the Israel lobby hating that, the Tories hated that. And you've got people like Robbie Gibb, very, very powerful in the BBC, who himself was sort of wrapped up in buying the Jewish Chronicle, which is probably one of the most pro-Israel newspapers in the country. For some reason, that's okay. But they couldn't bear to have this likable guy who brings people together, who's great at hosting the football. Massive loss to the BBC. Match of the Day is not going to be the same next season. If ITV pick him up for the World Cup, the BBC are going to be like kicking themselves. They're going to be terrified that that's going to happen. Or Sky or Amazon or whoever. Hopefully he won't go to Amazon. But there we are. Kieran, I don't know if you're a big football fan, but I think watching that, sort of seeing how much it meant to Gary Lineker, how much it meant to, the guys co-hosting with him. Again, Alan Shearer and Micah Richards, they're not these sort of like raving political lefties. They're just people who were footballers who inspired people at home, who can also tell right from wrong, who was sad to see someone who's clearly, the best in the business when it comes to football going because he objected to kids getting burnt alive.
Yeah. I mean, first of all, the least important part, I am a big football fan. I stayed up. I don't usually do this on a Saturday night, but I did stay up to watch That makes it sound like I go to bed.
Yeah, what time do you go to bed? It's
Usually
only on
out.
at half 10, isn't it?
I'm usually out. I like to think I'm usually out.
So you mean you stayed in?
I stayed in. What am I saying? Sunday night, but bank holiday. That's why I'm confused. I stayed in and I watched
Good save.
his last match of the day. Yeah, thank you. And half an hour before the show started, he popped up. Gary Lineker popped up to say, join us in half an hour. And this is what you can expect. Right. And then he went off air and it went to BBC News. And the headline, because as we said earlier, some of this is starting to filter onto mainstream media. The headline was about the aid blockade. And the BBC was showing images of skeletal, starving, or emaciated children, babies, toddlers, and so on. And that really underscored for me the utter inverted morality, the utter depravity of the situation. So you've got babies and toddlers, and adults too, by the way, being starved to death or to the point of death, essentially with British backing. And then you've got a beloved television presenter calling the starvation out in very reasonable terms. Because he shared a video with an emoji of a rat, he is fired, essentially. I mean, nothing, to my mind, could be a greater indictment of the media establishment, the BBC, or the moral and intellectual climate of this country than that juxtaposition right there. Those two things side by side. And just to say, I mean, about Gary Lineker, away from the politics, if you like, Gary Lineker is unquestionably one of the best things to ever happen to English football. And he's unquestionably one of the best things to ever happen to the BBC. He, as much as anyone else, maybe more than anyone else, helped the BBC survive in the age of Netflix, Prime, and so on. And they're complete and utter mugs. They're mugs for getting rid of him. They really are. We were talking about it earlier. As if anybody, when the World Cup in 2026 starts, is going to say, oh, yeah, of course, they had to. It's not Gary Lineker presenting it. As he was, by the way, even though he'd stepped down from Match of the Day after this season, he was, I should have said and give context, he was set to present the World Cup next year. But because of the rat emoji, and because of speaking out about this genocide, he's been pulled from that. And the idea that anybody, any football fan or anyone else is going to say, yeah, no, that was the right decision. Of course, that rat emoji was beyond the pale in that video. Of course they're not. Nobody's even going to remember why he's not presenting it. They're just going to be disgruntled. And the quality of the shows, as you just said, Michael, is just going to be lower. It's going to be lower grade across the board. And that is because Gary Lineker exudes warmth and humanity. And that is what made him such a brilliant television presenter, especially in the context of sport, which, you know, sports people do their best when they become presenters or pundits or whatever, but usually they are like drained of any personality. They're droids. Gary Lineker really stood out because of his warmth and humanity. And lo and behold, that extends, it turns out, to politics and to, you know, people suffering in the world. The silver lining is, I'll end on the silver lining. The silver lining is that now he can say and do whatever he wants. He's not answerable to anybody. He has no paymaster. He runs Goal Hanger podcasts. That makes a lot of money. He's obviously minted anyway. He doesn't need to answer to anybody. He can post about whatever he likes, and he can talk about Palestine and other groups of people suffering in the world as much as he likes. And indeed, I see that already today on his Instagram, he shared the story about the Gazan mother who lost 9 of her 10 children.
Yeah, hopefully we can get him on Novara soon. Zack Polanski's pitch for leader of the Greens is that he can have a bigger impact on the media by proactively defending left-wing policies. He had a big test this weekend with an appearance on Laura Kuenssberg's BBC show.
Zack, do you have any sympathy for the position that the government is in? I mean, they did take over at a time when the economy had been being battered because of Ukraine and because of COVID. Public services have had a hard time for a long time. When you look at what they're doing and the sort of straitjacket they're in, do you have any sympathy for them?
No, I don't think it's easy, but I think it's very simple. We actually need to tax wealth and not work. And you asked Angela Rayner several times at that beginning of the interview, will you tax wealthy people more? And she gave you some very small measures that are tinkering at the edges. Actually, if we put a wealth tax on assets of 1%, we could be raising billions of pounds.
But won't they then leave? So you earn less money because all the wealthy leave.
Well, so it's actually a myth. There's a group called the Patriotic Millionaires, who are a group of wealthy individuals who are saying taxes more. Because actually, no matter how rich you are, we all benefit from a more equal society.
There's quite a lot of evidence, though, that many very wealthy people have left the country. If you talk to anyone in the city, that's what they would tell you. And people who put forward suggestions of wealth taxes, when those things have been brought in before, they often don't deliver anything like what you might hope.
Well, I'd refute that evidence, but I'd say more fundamentally, if people don't want to spend money in tax to our public services, then are they really contributing to our country? I'd say more widely on your question too. Angela Rayner talked about a humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza. I describe it as a genocide. And when we have a government that are ultimately complicit, in fact, actively participating by arming them, I think when the public watch interviews like that, it just feels completely disconnected from material reality. And that's both on domestic affairs, but also international affairs too. And I think both interviews are an example of why people are rejecting the two old parties, because they're seeing politicians say things that just materially aren't reality.
That clip's been viewed a couple of 100,000 times on X, which will presumably be helpful to Zack's leadership campaign. Kieran, how do you think he did?
Well, I think, first of all, Michael, you did much better job of interviewing him than Laura Kuenssberg did, because you didn't ask absurd questions. Yeah, I mean, look, I don't know what to make of Zack Polanski. I think we're all in the same boat on the left. We're tentatively hopeful. I'm tentatively hopeful. Of course, there was a lot of stuff dredged up about what he'd said about Corbyn and anti-Semitism and so on. But I think he gave a pretty cogent answer to that when you asked him about it, Michael. In that particular clip, it's really good that we're normalizing politicians saying the G word, saying genocide on shows like the Laura Kuenssberg show. That's a good thing. And, we need to try and kind of normalize that as much as possible, because, of course, we know that that's what's actually going on. But there was one thing, I just seeing that more or less for the first time. There is one major thing that he could have said that he didn't say, specifically about the taxation thing. I wish he'd said about assets not being able to shift assets out of the country, essentially. So he talks about Patriotic Millionaires, the group, fine. He talks about how there's actually, some data and evidence to suggest that people don't, there isn't an exodus. But he didn't talk about the fact that when you tax assets, which are static assets that exist in the UK, land, buildings, etc., you can't move those out physically. And I think that was probably his ace of spades there, but he didn't really use it. So that's fine. It's not the end of the world. But yeah, overall, I think he did well. And I think his kind of left populism, an inverted Farageism or something, a bit of charisma, a bit of personality and a bit of flair wouldn't go amiss on the left and left populism and so on. So let's see. I think, but I think, in the area that I alluded to, room for improvement.
Yeah, I thought he did well. I hope he wins. I think he makes the sort of political scene much more interesting than if the other two do. We've still no one can remember his name. Adrian Ramsey, I do know his name now, but it did take me a while. And if you look at the YouGov polls, no one really knows who he is. Obviously, no one knows who Zack Polanski is either, but he hasn't been party for 2 or 3 years. So I think if you've been a party leader for that long and still no one knows who you are, it's probably time for a change. So on we've been talking about this in the studio, that we need to get more people on who can sort of talk us through the step-by-step of how a wealth tax works, because the response that people always give, sort of, as you saw Laura Kuenssberg do there, is to say, wealth tax, great idea, doesn't work. And I need to sort of find some people who can sort of articulately explain exactly how it works. Because I know Gary Stevenson says, well, you can't move the asset, so you just tax the asset. Now, I suppose the response to that would be that it's very politically difficult to tax, people's first homes. So if you're only trying to tax the super rich do have some of their assets sort of physically in the street, their big houses. But it's once you get to the super rich that you are talking about shares and sort of paper money.
Yeah.
Someone's worth 100 million or 100 billion because they own XYZ company, which is worth XYZ on the stock market. And I suppose they are the people who can potentially move. I don't really have the answers here. I suppose I'm putting that to you. Is it as simple enough as saying, well, you can't move the house abroad, so a wealth tax is easy? How do you see it working in practice?
I mean, look, just on the stocks and shares and that kind of thing, the most effective way, I think, to tax that would be what's called a financial transaction tax. So it gained popularity after the financial crisis. It was synonymized as a Tobin tax, named after a guy called Tobin who proposed it, an economist. That would be basically a tax that taxes every single transaction that goes through the ether, if you like, in the financial system, which would have two effects. It would gain it would obviously draw money to the exchequer or to the treasury, but it would also caution against speculative, very reckless speculative gambling in the financial system, right? Because obviously if you're having to pay every time you make a transaction, you're less likely to just say, fuck it, I'll do whatever. So basically a wealth tax is a composite term for a multitude of things. And you're right, Michael, it's kind of, it's quite an obtuse term because it's a composite term. So I think just to make it kind of simple, because we've only got 3 minutes left, you could look at very basic things like taking us from a kind of council tax system, if you like, to a land value tax system in this country. And that would, the clue is in the name, it would tax land on the basis of its value. That's something that even people like Tony Blair have thrown their weight behind. 10, 15 years ago, Blair said he was in favour of it after he left office. So it's something that does kind of unite quite a broad section of political and intellectual opinion. So a wealth tax could be a land value tax. A wealth tax could be a windfall tax. I mean, it could be a windfall tax on a business, right? It could be a windfall tax on a sector that's done particularly well. It could be raising capital gains so that it goes from around 10%, which is absurdly low, to bring it in line with income tax, right? So the income tax bracket. What Zack Polanski was saying about tackling wealth, not work. When we talk about work, the traditional tax obviously is the income tax, and what a wealth tax could do. One thing a wealth tax could do, quite a modest thing really, is bring capital gains, so the money that you accrue on, things like properties and land and so on, after the time of purchase, you could bring it in line with income tax, and that would net, I think some studies suggest around 10 billion a year additional money for the treasury. So there are many things that you could do, and you're right to kind of break it into, static assets that are in the UK, which is kind of what I was referring to as could have been a good counter argument to what Laura Kuenssberg was saying. And then, of course, the kind of more, amorphous digital kind of financial transactions, which you would need international cooperation on. You'd need an international agreement around financial transaction taxes.
Yeah, I'm very into land value taxes. I quite like the Georgists, but I think politicians always say it's very difficult because then, it got sort of floated, I think, in sort of when Corbyn was leader, sort of just put in a paper by Laurie McFarlane and some other people who've been on the show. And then even the fact that this research paper had been done, The Sun and the Daily Mail were like, Labour want to tax your garden. So it's always very politically difficult. So it's always hard to sort of, how are you going to do the tax where the rich can't leave, but you don't hit enough middle-class people that the newspapers or that the right sort of have a good attack line against you? Very interesting question. We're going to have to sort of really break this down in future shows, I think. Exactly how would a wealth tax work beyond the slogans. We'll bring that to you soon, don't worry. But for now, we are out of time. Kieran, thank you so much for joining me this evening. Always a pleasure having you on.
Thanks for having me, Michael.
And thank you everyone for tuning in. Come back tomorrow for another live stream from 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.